Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone podcast, episode number 669, for the 1st of August 2021. Richard Saunders here, coming to you from Sydney, Australia, in lockdown, and happy birthday to all the horses. August the 1st being the horse's birthday. The reasoning says that irrefutable source of all knowledge, the internet. The reasoning was because horses were placed in races according to their age, so it was therefore easier to have all the horses' birth date deemed as August 1st of the year they were born. Although it began in the racing industries, these days many breeds and competitions consider August 1st the horse's birthday. Happy birthday, horses! I wonder if all the cats in the world have the same birthday. And yes, it's 2021, not 2020, as I said last week on the show. And when I see the news coming out from parts of the world, the United States, for example, it's like 2020 all over again. The Delta strain, the Delta variation, the Delta variant, the Delta evolution, the COVID evolution, there must be lots of words, I'll look at my thesaurus later, is starting to, well, it's well underway, wreaking havoc in many parts of the world. Sydney is in its, what is it now, its 5th week? I think we're in our 5th week of lockdown with no end in sight. The numbers continue to grow, fluctuating as they go, but they are more or less on the uptick. That is the number of new infections each day. And I don't have very long to wait for my second AstraZeneca vaccination. And then a couple of weeks after that, I will be as vaccinated as I can be at the moment anyway. I would much rather be spending my time visiting nice parks and gardens for nice strolls. I guess I can still do that in lockdown, but very carefully. In fact, I went for a walk yesterday along a nice park, but I was wearing my mask. And so were a lot of other people. Which brings me to our first story. We're going to look at the protest that wasn't. Now, a week ago here in Sydney, just over a week ago, there was a massive protest against the lockdown with people chanting freedom now, all thinking they're fierce warriors or freedom fighters or something like that. Well, they threatened to do it, or it was in the wind that there'd be another mass protest yesterday here in Sydney. It turned out to be a complete and utter flop. The police were out in force, but really nobody bothered to show up. And we'll also be looking at why some people are now full of regret. Following that, it's news from Australian Skeptics with the Australian Skeptics newsletter written and compiled by Tim Mendham. This week, that segment will be read by Adrian Hill. Then we look at some more COVID-19 craziness with anti-vaccination letters and flyers being put out by Clive Palmer, the once politician, larger-than-life businessman here in Australia. An unfortunate story indeed. Then we'll round off with the Trove archives. This week we dig through those archives looking for references in Australian history, in the print anyway, to psychics and murder. Well, that's enough for me at the moment. Before we get stuck into the show, it's time for me to race downstairs like a horse, have some oats and carrots. And while I do that, I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone. The protest that wasn't. Now, as I mentioned at the top of the show last week here in Sydney, there was a massive anti-lockdown, freedom now, vaccines are a conspiracy, 5G, blah, 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 rally with a lot of the usual suspects, but a lot of just people, just people who hadn't really given this the correct amount of critical examination, hadn't thought it through properly. And so last all week, the government were bringing home the message that how dangerous the Delta variant is, and how that if anyone tried to protest yesterday here in Sydney, a week after the big protest, they would be met by the force of the force. May the force be with you. A strong police presence. And yes, there was a massive police presence yesterday in downtown Sydney. And on the way to Sydney, if you were travelling into the city in your car or on the train, there were police blocks and checks and things like that. And so we pick up the story here, a link I've noticed in the Daily Mail online. And this is a very telling report, I think. The report is by Tita Smith. And it says, "My closest friends believe I'm an idiot. Freedom fighter who screamed, 'We run Sydney' at violent anti-lockdown protest reveals his mates have deserted him." And the bullet points, "Anti-lockdown protester Romeo has admitted his views have cost him friends." The Western Sydney man was at the 3,500 strong rally in the Central Business District last Saturday. Footage posted online shows him shouting, "We run Sydney" at the demonstration. In a video posted on YouTube, he reveals his closest friends think he is an idiot. The rally sparked widespread outrage as millions of others abide by restrictions. And this is true. This is one of the things that became apparent, was the vast majority of people in this city are doing the right thing, and they have a very dim view indeed of these protesters, these freedom protesters, who ultimately probably have caused an extension to the lockdown. The story goes on to say, violent clashes erupted between police and unmasked protesters who packed close together chanting anti-vax slogans and holding signs demanding freedom while spouting conspiracy theories. Footage posted on social media shows Mr. Georges, who hails from the city's COVID-hit western suburbs, breaching stay-at-home orders and attending the rally as he issued a message to New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian. Oh, and of course, one of the things that have aided police no end is the number of people who have posted their own social media videos showing themselves at the protest and showing lots of other people at the protest. And the police have received thousands of tip-offs from the general public to identify the people who were at the rally. And police are going around arresting them or issuing heavy fines. It's quite something. She, Mrs. Berejiklian, who is the Premier of New South Wales, that is the head of government here, she thinks she can lock out the West. "We run Sydney," he jeers. And it goes on to say the rallies sparked widespread public outrage as they threatened to derail the city's fight against the Delta outbreak. Now Mr. Georges has revealed even his closest friends believe he's an idiot because of his unorthodox beliefs. The video, which has racked up more than 3,200 views, probably a lot more by now. And this article is quite lengthy, so you can read that for yourself about more of the impact and comments. Here's one. Here's a line. So far, 63 protesters have been charged with various offences and more arrests are expected. More than 255 public infringement notices have already been issued, and that would have been increased by now, I imagine. But here is a little bit of what Mr. Georges had to say.
I will no longer be on social media. I've had my closest friends, when I look into their eyes, I can see that they believe I'm an idiot. I'm a dope. And in recent weeks, their theories of me, I'm starting to believe myself. I've lost my mates. They're still part of my life, but I've lost them in the way that I used to have them. I'm no longer considered to them the old Romeo. Now I'm just a Looney Tune. And believe it or not, they're right.
So while we don't respect his decision to protest and scream and yell and carry on, at least he's been bold enough to front up and post something on social media to say how wrong he was. And to relay the impact this is having on his life. Because he, like thousands of other people, fell for the con, which is conspiracy theories. And speaking of regret, my friend Celestia Ward from Squaring the Strange podcast, that fine podcast, Celestia lives in Las Vegas, and I'm sure she won't mind, has posted these words on social media. She says, "Was just watching a local news spot and a man in his 40s who just died. He and his fiancée had vowed to wait a year before taking the vaccine, quote, just to see if it was really safe," end quote. They have 5 kids. The youngest is 1. And then she and they rushed him to the ER on Blue Diamond. That's half a mile from me. And Celestia goes on to say the man worked at a resort not far from where she is. And she goes on to say later on, "My neighbours are dying, and so are yours. If you have family, friends, co-workers hesitant to get vaccinated, please try to show them that waiting is more dangerous, by orders of magnitude." The bereaved mom of 5 got vaccinated immediately, as did her oldest child.
Monday night, early Tuesday morning, I would say around 3-4 o'clock in the morning, he wakes me up panicking. He's like, I can't breathe. He's like, I know. He's like, something's wrong. He's like, I can't breathe. He's like, I tried to stand up and I fell over. I'm falling in. I can't. I don't know we got to go. So I took him to the emergency room. I took him to the Dignity Health. Just kept telling him, you're going to get through this. You got to come home to us. But I was able to call him before they took him in, and he was sat on the phone and I was able to hear him. I was like, please keep fighting. Don't give up. He's like, I'm trying to fight. He's like, but they're going to intubate me and put me under. We wanted to wait just 1 year from the release to see what effects people had. But there was never any intention to not get it. That was one of the last text messages he sent to me, was that he wished he would have. Because even if it stopped a little bit of the symptoms, it could have stopped. It's progressing so fastly. I expected to get 30 more years with him. I didn't expect him to be gone.
And we're seeing more and more stories of this sort of regret. People on ventilators gasping, bitterly regretting their decision not to get vaccinated, or bitterly regretting listening to conspiracy theorists as they are in the emergency ward or in critical care. What's the harm of believing in conspiracy theories? What's the harm of conspiracy theories? This couple of years in the history of our society should teach us that lesson very clearly. The harm is you could end up dead.
Hi, this is Heidi Robertson from the Northern Rivers Vaccination Supporters. We are a group of concerned citizens dedicated to promoting good science and common sense in our region, the far north coast of New South Wales. This area, famous for its natural beauty and relaxed lifestyle, also has the lowest rates of vaccination in Australia. We are out to change that by challenging the myths and misinformation and by providing good evidence-based information to the community. We'd love for you, no matter where you are in the world, to join our fight. Please visit our webpage at www.nrvs.info. We also have a link there to our Facebook page. Tweet us at NRVaxSupporters, that's VAX, and check us out on Wikipedia by searching for Northern Rivers Vaccination Supporters. Thank you.
Hi everyone, this is Adrienne Hill, and this week I'm reading the highlights from the Australian Skeptics newsletter, written and compiled by Tim Mendham. This is newsletter number 128, which was posted on the 27th of July. Convention, protesters, energy healing, misinformers, and critical thinking. Hi all. It says, Again, a quiet fortnight, which is probably a good thing considering the issues many of us are facing. Yes, there is COVID, but thank heavens for the pet psychic. As in a psychic for pets, not the sort of psychic that sleeps on an old blanket in the laundry. Although on second thoughts, Skepticon 2021. Register your interest now. Registrations of interest are now open for Skepticon, the 2021 Australian Skeptics Annual National Convention, which this year will be held on November 20th to 21st. It will be a joint event held by Australian skeptics in Sydney, Australia, and the New Zealand skeptics in Wellington, New Zealand, with face-to-face and online participation available, COVID willing. Note that, of course, should the current situation in Sydney regarding COVID and lockdowns continue, then we may be forced to have an online-only convention for the Sydney component. Details of the speakers and ticket prices will be available soon, but in the meantime, please register your interest at skepticon.org.au. That's skepticon.org.au, so you can receive the latest info. And there is a link for that in the newsletter. Anti-vaxxers promise more protests. Anti-lockdown protesters have promised to return in greater numbers for more demonstrations in coming weeks, with plans for large gatherings nationwide, including in Sydney and Canberra. Not good news at all. Lorna Jane fined $5 million for COVID-19 prevention claims about its clothing. Australian clothing firm Lorna Jane has been fined $5 million in the federal court for claiming its clothes prevent the transmission of COVID-19. The court labeled the claim predatory and exploitive. The company claimed its antivirus activewear had been sprayed with a substance called LJ Shield, which protected people against pathogens. Survey on Reiki and energy healing. Bond University researchers are undertaking a survey entitled Comparing Attitudes Towards Energy Healing and Reiki amongst Medical, Allied Health Professionals, and the General Public. The research is part of a PhD examining the risks and benefits of complementary medicine and less orthodox practices such as energy healing and Reiki. Feel free to complete the survey, which takes about 10 minutes. And don't forget that each of these items in the newsletter is accompanied by a link. Most influential spreader of coronavirus misinformation. Joseph Mercola tops the Disinformation Dozen, a list of 12 people responsible for sharing 65% of all anti-vaccine messaging on social media. Conspiracy theorists lack critical thinking skills. The more people believe in conspiracy theories, the worse they perform on critical thinking tests, a new study has confirmed. This doesn't mean that conspiracy theorists are necessarily lacking intelligence, but rather that they lack the skills to objectively analyze and evaluate a situation. The June 2021 issue of The Skeptic, the magazine from Australian skeptics, is out, with a major feature on why people believe as opposed to what they believe, what psychologists and science leaders think, the legal implications of holding beliefs, and case studies of the victory of belief over reason. We also look at the myths and conspiracies associated with the Port Arthur massacre, that tragic event which occurred 25 years ago, and much more to read. Events. While some skeptic groups are running their regular Skeptics in the Pub get-togethers online, same talks but BYO beer, an increasing number are returning to the live face-to-face format. Check your local guides to see when and where such activities are on, or if they are on, considering any COVID restrictions. Events listed for Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, and other locations in Australia. I wish I could go. And finally, here are some items of interest. Haven't noticed any psychic animals picking winners at the Olympics, probably because it's more than a 1 and 2 choice in most sports. Travel tip for some time in the future. Paranormal Dublin. 16 of the most haunted spots. Think churches, pubs, and castles. Stereotypical Irish stuff? Pet Psychic's predictions for next year. Pet psychic Samantha Mills, who did 4 whole tests to qualify as an animal communicator, predicts a good year for guinea pigs and budgies. A bad year for Staffordshire Terriers, and goldfish are going to be dead in the water. Now, there is much more to read, and you can enjoy the Australian Skeptics newsletter every other week by signing up at www.skeptics.com.au.
Hi, this is Susan Gerbic from GSOW. That's Guerrilla Skepticism on Wikipedia. I want to thank everyone who, via the Skeptic Zone podcast, has contacted me to become an editor on Wikipedia. Together, we have worked on or created over 1,200 Wikipedia pages. Countless thousands of people all over the world access those pages each day. In fact, we're over 52 million page views. Like many listeners, I also give back to the Skeptic Zone via monthly micropayments, and I want to encourage you to do the same. Is the information and entertainment you get each week from the show worth $5 or $10 a month? I sure think it is. Follow the link at skepticzone.tv and show your practical support. Thank you.
Now, with more bad news coming out of Sydney, coming out of New South Wales about the COVID numbers, it's very scary, very worrying to be in this neck of the woods, I can tell you. And what doesn't help, what really doesn't help, are what I'm seeing posted here online. People are getting in their letterboxes letters, mass mail out, from apparently Clive Palmer. Now, we've spoken about Clive Palmer on the show before, the ex-politician from the Palmer United Party, whose motto was, slogan anyway, make Australia great again. Firmly a anti-vaxxer conspiracy theorist. And in a large envelope that says in big bold letters, to the adult householder, urgent communication. Opened sealed section to view, ! And the first page we have a picture of some poor person in hospital, and it says, COVID-19 vaccine, not safe, not effective, not approved. Learn the truth below before making a decision that could hurt you and your family. Since the beginning of the vaccine rollout to 20 June 2021, the Therapeutics Goods Administration has received 318 reports of death in people who have recently been vaccinated in Australia. They received 31,641 reports of adverse events, and there's a little link to a government website. Of course, this is absolutely putting it out of context, that naturally, normally, people simply die in the community every year, and a percentage of those people would have had the COVID vaccine regardless. People simply grow old and die, or die of other reasons. So that is absolutely misleading. The next page says, you can say no. No one can force you to do anything. The owner of your body and mind is you. With little graphics showing vaccination. The next one is showing a group of people with a target of a gun sight crosshead on them, so I'm not sure what that's about. The next one is a clock. I guess that means curfew or stay at home. The next one are a male and female wearing face masks, so you don't have to wear face masks, I guess. The next symbol is one meaning social distancing, so forget that. And finally, we have an iPhone or an iDevice or a smartphone with a QR code. So don't worry about those. No. Down the bottom, there are laws that provide protection for you to say no. And there appear to be more pages to this, but I'll get to the last one, apparently the last one. Australians have the right to be fully informed. Informed consent is a fundamental prerequisite for any medical treatment. Australia has signed the international conventions guaranteeing such consent. There are serious questions to be asked over the financial and other interests of the Therapeutics Goods Administration's so-called expert committees. I am sure in the future that those committees will be shown not to be as independent as they should be and not to contain experts from all states and all relevant universities. Yours faithfully, Clive Palmer. And there's more information cherry-picked from government websites to try and put the picture that people who have had the vaccine are doing very poorly. And down the bottom, only one death from COVID-19 in 2021. Well, now, sadly, since that's been written, that number is growing every day. The next line. There is no pandemic in Australia. The next line. 318 deaths after COVID-19 vaccine, ... and 31,600 adverse reactions. Why has the government given doctors indemnity if the COVID-19 vaccine causes you harm or death? ? And the link at the bottom they want you to go to, Clive wants you to go to, is the truth about Covert Vaccines.com. All right, I'll bite. I'll have a look. The truth about COVID vaccines. Informed consent is important. The TGA reports 300 plus deaths following administration of the COVID vaccine since February, and sort of repeating the information from the mail-out, plus lots of other former mail-outs and urgent communications and letters and links and videos and so on. And I wonder why this sort of thing is allowed to continue. This was even picked up on Media Watch, the Media Watchdog program here in Australia, about Clive Palmer's antics and false information. So with things going from bad to worse to very worse to very, very, very worse here, especially in Sydney, it just is galling to see that this character, this Clive Palmer, Make Australia Great Again, is continuing to disseminate his anti-vaccination conspiracy theories. And now, thanks to one of my ever alert listeners, Graham Donald. Graham has sent me this bit of information, and he writes, I saw this story on Yahoo News and thought you might like to know about how anti-vaxxers are trying to set up a Facebook campaign to encourage people to falsely register for vaccination in an attempt to waste vaccines. And if we pop over to Yahoo News, I'll link to this on the show notes so you can see this for yourself. The news item, which was published on Thursday, the 29th of July, Facebook users disturbing ploy to waste thousands of vaccines, as reported by Rebecca Davis. And in part it says, a disturbing post has been circulating on Facebook which encourages anti-vaxxers to book COVID-19 vaccination appointments and not show up in a bid to waste supply. A Facebook user has screenshot a Geelong Advertiser article about hundreds of vaccine no-shows in Victoria and written, quote, how to play their game, end quote, over the image. Comments on the post, which are captioned, do it, include, great idea, just made a booking, and maybe we should flood their phones with fake bookings and fake names and phone numbers. The controversial call to action, controversial, that's putting it mildly. The controversial call to action has since been shared across multiple groups by other Facebook users, urging others to report the content. Quote, they are booking vaccinations only to not show up. This is terrible and needs to be reported. And darn right. The most disturbing behavior that the cult has come up with in this pandemic, end quote, one person posted one person. And they're not far wrong. In certain respects, the anti-vaccination movement certainly has all the hallmarks of a cult. And later on it says, health authorities disappointed over ploy to waste vaccines. In a statement to Yahoo News, the Department of Health said the Australian government does not endorse this behaviour. Well, that's hardly a shock. And the quote here is, "It is disappointing to hear that people are actively taking steps to jeopardise the operation of these businesses and placing greater strain on vaccination rollout, impacting the safety of their family, friends and local communities. It is important for Australians to have access to credible and timely information about COVID-19 vaccines. We encourage everyone to follow health advice and get their vaccination as soon as possible if they are eligible." And there's more to read there in that article, but if you're interested, you can just follow the link in the show notes this week. Now, this segment of the show is being recorded before the weekend, and I don't know what's going to happen on Saturday. By the time you hear this, you may well know, and I may well put whatever happens on Saturday here in Sydney before this in the running of the Skeptic Zone this week. And of course, I'm referring to the threats of another mass protest for freedom and so on, which threatens to be yet another super spreader event because Delta variation of COVID-19 is a different ballgame altogether. And one of the tangents to this story, all sorts of announcements are going up and posts on Facebook and things like that. Here's one related to that story. Somebody has posted on a group, community service announcement, calling all freedom-loving patriots of the MacArthur region who have received face mask fines for the first 18 months of the pandemic. In capital letters, you must contest your fines in court. Now it just goes on with some more waffle about face masks and hazards and things like that, and ends with, "Thanks, patriots, for your messages of support. My inbox has been overwhelmed with messages of support and encouragement. I will endeavour to reply to each one. Thanks." But what I'm pointing out here is the word patriot. I mean, this is not a term we would normally use in Australia. Calling all freedom-loving patriots. This is American language. This is terms they use in America where they're running down the street yelling freedom, born from, of course, their War of Independence, and still carried to this day by many people in that country, where it's almost a fanaticism. It's a little hard for Australians to comprehend sometimes, but this language, calling on all freedom-loving patriots, that's lifted straight out of some American post. You'd almost have to be sure. And it's sort of aligned too with the sovereign citizen movement, which has infected this country, where people are, for example, pulled over by the police for a faulty brake light or going over the speed limit or whatever the case. And they start showing papers printed straight off the internet about freedom of movement and sovereign citizens' rights, and I'm not part of the corporation, and I didn't sign a contract and all this sort of stuff. So it seems to me these people have a lot of time to download material from the United States and look at YouTube videos, but they don't seem to have too much time to actually read the Australian Constitution and know what their true rights and freedoms are in this country. And it's worth repeating, of all the things that the skeptical movement has been engaged with fighting over the years, maybe the most important is fighting misinformation when it comes to conspiracy theories. Of course, conspiracy theories certainly lie at the root of many of the strange and crazy behavior we see these days.
Hi there, I'm Abhijit and I host the Rationable podcast on BeRationable.com. Every couple of weeks, I science the hell out of alternative medicines, health and nutrition fads, social media forwards, science news, and lots more. Of course, you can find all of my articles, podcast episodes, and lots more on www.berationable.com. See you there, and until then, always be rational.
Let's head back to the Trove archives at trove.nla.gov.au for those digitised newspapers and magazines and so on, catalogued and stored by the National Library of Australia. And free for you to peruse online, just like I do each week, to find interesting stories from history related to the paranormal and skeptical spheres. And sort of trailing on from last week's theme of psychics and police, this week I thought we'd look up psychics and murder. And one of the first returns doing that search brings us to the Canberra Times on the 28th of March 1990, and a story relating to probably the most famous missing persons cases in Australian history, which is that of the Beaumont children. No trace of the children has ever been found, and why this is particularly interesting to skeptics is that there have been a long trail of psychics, a long line, a long group of psychics, whatever you call a group of psychics, over the decades, claiming to have information about these children, including the most famous, a Dutch psychic at the time, who visited Adelaide about a year after the children went missing, called Gerard Cosset. Now, I wrote about this whole situation, the Beaumont children and various psychics, in the pages of the Skeptic magazine, the journal from Australian skeptics, and I shall link to that issue in this week's show notes if you want to read more about this famous case and the psychics involved. Psychic, quote, sees, end quote, missing SA children. SA, of course, meaning South Australia. Adelaide. Police will interview a woman today who claims psychic powers have led her to the burial place of 5 missing Adelaide children, the Beaumonts, Christy Gordon and Joanne Radcliffe. June Cox, 51, and incidentally I think she was mentioned in a story in last week's Trove segment, yes. June Cox, 51, said yesterday that she had spoken to police this week telling them she believed she knew where the bodies could be found, on Crown land near the Myponga Reservoir in the Adelaide Hills. And for those of you who are wondering, Crown land means government land. She said the children had haunted her for 11 years with visions of where they were buried. Mrs. Cox said she had also had visions connecting the disappearance of the children in 1966 and 1973 and the 1979 murder of Alan Barnes and the 1972 drowning of Dr. George Duncan. The Beaumont children, Jane 9, Anna 7 and Grant 4, disappeared from a suburban beach 24 years ago. Christy Gordon and Joanne Radcliffe were abducted from Adelaide Oval in 1973. Despite intensive investigations, their bodies have never been found. 2 weeks ago, in the Adelaide Magistrates Court, a man already in prison for murder and also charged in connection with the Barnes killing was linked with the disappearance of the 5 children. A witness told the court that 43-year-old homosexual Bevan Spencer von Enum had admitted to him that he had killed the children and dumped their bodies in the Myponga Reservoir. Mrs. Cox said she believed the children were not actually in the reservoir, but in shallow graves nearby. She said the children had talked to her because they wanted their souls at rest. Asked why she had not come forward earlier, she said, "I firmly believe that everything has its time. And a quick search for June Cox brings us results dating back only a couple of years. So apparently she is still doing the rounds. Well, at least she was a few years back. In any case, what I can gather from that, at least at the time, was it was probably a case of somebody who really did believe they had magical powers and could receive messages from the dead and so on. But let's go further back in time. From the 90s, we go back to the 1930s. Queensland Times, Ipswich in Queensland, dated the 29th of January 1936. Jack the Ripper. Discovery by psychic science. A man wearing a Scotch tweed suit and light overcoat with a dark felt hat pulled down over his eyes stepped onto a bus at Notting Hill in London. And just quickly, it's interesting here in this report, the word bus begins with an apostrophe because it is an abbreviation of the word omnibus. So in the 1930s, in some situations, they were calling it a bus, but making sure to remember that it's a longer word which has been shortened. That's interesting. When the bus pulled up at Lancaster Gate, a man in front leaned over to his wife and said, "That man in the opposite corner is Jack the Ripper." "Don't be idiotic," his wife retorted. "I am not. I know it. I feel it." The husband was so confident, states a London Evening News writer, that he trailed the stranger from Marble Arch and asked a policeman to arrest him. The policeman scoffed. That was in 1883. Physician of standing. Today, Mr. Edwin T. Woodhall, formerly of New Scotland Yard, claims that the husband was right. He was a clairvoyant who had led the Yard to the home of the killer. In a black japanned box, somewhere in the archives of the British Home Office, there are the confidential papers concerning the identity of the most mysterious and spectacular murder of the past 100 years, Mr. Woodhall writes. Speculation has always been rife as to Jack the Ripper's identity. He was never brought to justice, and it is commonly believed that the police were as ignorant as were the public as to who this prowling, maniacal butcher really was. Actually, the supernatural powers of clairvoyance resulted in the tracking down of Jack the Ripper. My claim is that he was tracked down by a clairvoyant and that his identity was known to authorities. The name of this clairvoyant was Robert James Lees. He enjoyed royal patronage and was received more than once at both Balmoral and Buckingham Palace by Queen Victoria for his wonderful public work in tracing and arresting Jack the Ripper. He, until the day of his death, received a pension from the Privy Purse. Nearly 50 years ago, unknown to the general public, a court of about a dozen well-known medical men of the highest integrity and standing held an inquiry concerning the alleged insanity of Jack the Ripper. It was definitely proved that he was a physician of high standing who lived in a select part of the West End. It transpired that the murderer was an ardent vivisectionist. The sight of pain, instead of softening him, had the opposite effect. This grew on him, and he took the fiercest delight in inflicting torture on all kinds of dumb and defenceless animals. It appears he was subject to sudden and unconquerable moods. By a strange contradiction, he was in his normal moods the most refined and gentle of men. Mr. Woodhall recounts that when in his study one evening the clairvoyant suddenly went into a trance and wrote down all the details of one of the Ripper's crimes. The facts were reported to Scotland Yard. Trail picked up. The clairvoyant later felt the same queer, indescribable feeling in the bus at Lancaster Gate, and again reported it to the police. In official communications that morning, there had been an anonymous card saying that the Ripper would be in the West End about that time. He had subsequent visions about the Ripper, and finally he was taken by the police to the scene of one of the murders. Presently he rose, and his eyes stared into vacancy, moved off rapidly in a westerly direction. He had picked up the psychic trail, Mr. Woodhall adds. Followed by the officials, he walked mile after mile, never once hesitating until he reached a street in the West End of London. Here, outside a big imposing-looking house, he stopped, reeled, and would have fallen but for the support of the inspector. "In there," he gasps. "The murderer." The inspector's heart sank. So the night's work, the result of which had been so confidently anticipated, had been wasted after all. For this house, before which the little group stood, was the residence of a very famous London physician. The clairvoyant, however, was so persistent in his claim, and, moreover, gave the inspector such startling corroboration by describing accurately the interior of the house, that it was decided to take a chance. Lengthy questioning of the doctor's wife brought to light the most amazing Jekyll and Hyde story ever heard. I have no actual proof of its truth, but during my years at the Yard it was more than once recounted to me as I have related, and I have not the smallest doubt it is true, and that psychic science, even 43 years ago, was enabled to step in where police work had lamentably failed, and led to the incarceration of one of the world's worst criminal lunatics. Mr. Woodhall concludes his account of the Ripper episode. The doctor, after being certified insane, was placed in a private asylum. In a London cemetery reposes an empty coffin, said to contain the remains of the famous West End physician whose death at an early age was mourned by London and the medical world. Jack the Ripper. That might be worthy of another search one day. References to psychics and specifically Jack the Ripper. I can only guess how many times over the decades and decades so-called psychics have come forward saying they knew the identity of Jack the Ripper. In the year 1937, on the 22nd of June, in the Barrier Minor from Broken Hill, Western Australia, psychic sees body of W. Lavers. Sydney, Tuesday. Arthur Ford, an American psychic, addressing a meeting of 3,000 people at Sydney Town Hall last night, declared he had located the body of William Henry Lavers, who was murdered at Grenfell last September. He added his body was lying almost beneath a fence, buried 2 miles from the store at which he was murdered. The body was carefully buried. It was near a ridge. He asserted that the position of the body had been revealed to him as he stood in a, quote, clairaudient, end quote, state before the audience. He also said he heard someone calling the name of Phoebe Priddle. The voice was that of her aunt, Mrs. Alvina. A woman in the body of the hall indicated that she was Mrs. Priddle. She said she had never been interested in spiritualism. Neither she nor her husband had even seen nor communicated with Ford before. She said it was amazing when Ford called out her name, adding that her aunt had died 12 months ago. The latter said before her death that she was interested in spiritualism and that if she could ever get a message through medium to them, she would do so. They laughed it off. And I keep thinking to myself when I'm reading these reports, and this one from 1937, how much I would have loved to have been in that audience at Sydney Town Hall all those years ago. And finally, we arrive in the year 1954, written in the pages of the Sunday Times from Perth, Western Australia, and the date is the 30th of May, a Sunday. And in the magazine section, he says that he's buried in the backyard. Murdered man writes to Perth woman. The decaying body of a murdered man is buried in the backyard of a premises in William Street, Perth. The man was killed in a gambling brawl many years ago. A greying, well-spoken 50-year-old woman living at Manning Park expressed this opinion yesterday when she spoke of persistent psychic communications she had received from the spirit of a dead man who had pleaded with her to unearth his body, to notify his wife, and to see that she, his wife, was well cared for the remainder of her physical life. She is Mrs. V. Utst, who specializes in renting haunted houses, and who in many ways was the most interested of dozens who applied to the Sunday Times for the tenancy of a reputed haunted house at Nedlands. Mrs. Utst showed a Sunday Times reporter, quote, spirit writing, end quote, she had executed during medium sessions in each of two, quote, haunted, end quote, houses in which she had lived for periods of several years. The most startling was one which purported to be that of a tall, dark man of medium age who was killed in a gambler's brawl at Spearwood in 1929 and was subsequently buried in a backyard in William Street. The beginning of one of his letters is shown above. And incidentally, that relates to a reproduction of a handwritten note, which is very hard to decipher, unfortunately. But it says something along the lines, yes, I am here, but you did not dig deep enough. It will take time. I am mainly underneath, washed through. It will take all your strength and enough to reach me. Courage and courage to reach me. It's very hard to read this handwriting. How can you dig underneath? It's very difficult to read, but it says something like that. Now you can dig underneath, I think it says. We read on. The message, which is quite long, goes on to outline the circumstances of the man's death, speaks of the man's connections in South Africa and of life generally in, quote, the other sphere, end quote. The letter is signed. This is one of many such communications Mrs. Utst maintains she has received in the past while holding the tenancy of premises with a reputation for being haunted. Others purport to be from the spirits of other deceased persons who were strangers to her. The letters are in different writings, although all were executed by the hand of Mrs. Utst. Mrs. Utst told of her experiences in the most objective fashion. She wished to make clear that she is not and never has been a professional medium or fortune teller, and is not now, in fact, practicing spiritualism. She looks upon her own receipt of the messages mentioned dubiously, but she declares that she received them in early seances when approaching the subject with an open, inquiring mind. And she makes no secret of the fact that although she is little more than an amateur in this field, she is inclined to a belief in spiritualism and feels that she and some other members of her intimate family are possessed of a rare gift. Most of her sons and daughters, she points out, are able to recall many everyday instances of telepathy with their mother. Mrs. Utst has never approached the CIB with her spiritual evidence of murder because she realizes police could not operate on such an intangible complaint. Within the framework of her subject, she told her story rationally. It could be, she posed, some manifestation of my subconscious taking control of me at certain times. But thought waves, Mrs. Utst reminds her own somewhat skeptical self, set up brain actions which can be recorded. What else? Mrs. Utst's chief problem at the moment is to secure satisfactory accommodation for some members of her large family of married and unmarried children. They need good, sound, tangible roofs over their equally tangible heads. At present, some members are living in deplorable circumstances in the back of a condemned shop, for which the rent has been raised and from which members of her family must quit. Mrs. Utst told the story of her previous experiences in haunted houses in the hopes that someone who cannot let a house because of its reputation will give her family the tenancy of such a residence. For instance, the reputed haunted house in Netherlands. Mrs. Utst will placate the ghosts or spirits, if they do exist, in order to give it a real spring or winter cleaning for some of her sons or daughters. And here's wishing her luck. Byline QS. And incidentally, on the story itself, there's a photograph of Mrs. Utst looking a little bit bewildered, I must say. And there we have it for another week. An interesting look through the Trove archives. I'm tempted now to look for references to Jack the Ripper and psychics. Why not? Maybe that'll be next week, or I might continue looking for other angles and interesting stories that come up when we research the paranormal in the print history of Australia. And you too can search for all sorts of things by visiting Trove at trove.nla.gov.au and spend many hours looking through those archives. You never know what you'll find. Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone this week. Thank you to the horses who stopped to listen to the Skeptic. I know I have a lot of listeners who are horses, I'm sure. You know, they go out for their morning trot, their morning exercise, and they have special headphones to keep up to date with the skeptical news on the Skeptic Zone podcast. And thank you to all those horses who also contribute by using PayPal or Patreon. You know, a little bit of their winnings each week go to the Skeptic Zone. To keep the show going. As I've mentioned before, during the lockdown, all my other work has dried up, gone away, having a little rest, gone on holiday, maybe escaped to the Antarctic where there's no coronavirus as far as I know. And so I don't, all my other sources of income aren't coming in. So I do rely quite a lot on you lovely horses and people, and some people, really some people, who contribute at skepticzone.tv. And if you're not one of them, I encourage you to be one. And I guess it comes down to if you enjoy the show, if you get something out of it, if it means something to you, if you listen to it each week, you learn something, you have a laugh along the way, then maybe it's worth at least $1 or $2 a week for you or to you. No matter where you are in the world, you can tune in this week to Skeptics in the Pub here in Sydney. Our special guest speaker will be Associate Professor Paul Willis, a long-time friend of the Skeptics, a former Skeptic of the Year, paleontologist Paul Willis, and you can find out more information on that talk, which will be Thursday night here in Sydney, Australian time, but since it's online, you can see that anywhere around the world on the Australian Skeptics Twitch page. And just go to meetup.com, look for Australian Skeptics. I'll put a link in the show notes, and you can join us for that live talk by Professor Paul Willis. Later on in the year, I'll be speaking for the Bay Area Skeptics in the San Francisco Bay Area about the Great Australian Prediction Project. And in November, we have the Australian Skeptics and New Zealand Skeptics combined national conventions. More details about that in the coming weeks with announcements of our special guest speakers. And we hope to have that partially in person, but we just don't know at the moment. So regardless, it will be online in some form or another. But for this week, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Lockdown, Sydney, Australia. You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv For show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter @Skeptic Zone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian skeptics or any other skeptical organisation.
Conspiracy theorists lack critical thinking skills. Sorry. Okay. See, I can giggle all by myself. And goldfish are going to be dead in the water. Oh, God. I already read this and I still can't help but laugh. Okay. Pet psychics predictions for next year.